Stalin was a tremendously cynical individual, but policy speaks louder than cynical remarks made with colleagues. And Soviet policy between 1933 and August of 39 was basically a anti-Nazi policy aimed at forming an alliance with the Western powers to contain Germany or defeat it in war if containment failed.
Hello, everyone. It's Jeff from the Burning Archive here, and I am back with my guest, Michael Carley, talking about his trilogy of books about international diplomacy in the 1930s, Stalin's Gamble, Stalin's Failed Alliance, and Stalin's Great Game. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, it's wonderful. There's been a wonderful response to our first discussion, which was the overview of the three books. Lots of comments, a lot of appreciation of your work and the stories you told in the interview. And yeah, so it's really great to have you back. We might do a couple of these, and in this one, we're going to really focus on your first book about Stalin's Gamble. A couple of the comments actually have been really interesting. There was one comment saying that Poland was ripped apart by two gangster states, the Soviet Union and Germany, and we might come back to Poland a little bit more in this discussion. But there was also quite a few comments on your remarks during the first interview about how the Cold War began in 1917, or that, there was a kind of ideological competition, I guess, between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. And this very much fits in with, I guess, a rival interpretation of Stalin's War, which I got out of the library the other day, Sean McMeekin's Stalin's War. And you've probably got your marked up copy there.
Yeah, I do.
Many more notes than I've done.
The reader said he would like to be able to see it, so I dug it out of the pile of my books just to show him. You can see all the pages that are tagged in my book.
Yeah. It doesn't
and there's one other thing we should mention. I wrote a long review of McMeekin, that written review in English that was published by H. Diplo, which is the online discussion network on international relations in the it's based in the United States. And if people are interested in what I had to, the details of my critique of McMeekin, they can find my written comments there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we might come back to McMeekin towards the end as well. It doesn't take very long to read the first few pages of McMeekin to get the sort of broad tenor of the argument. But I did get a comment from Nell Bonilla, who's she's doing a PhD actually at the moment, looking and has done a whole lot of research into transatlantic elites, and she really picked up on this comment about the Cold War beginning in 2017, saying that transatlantic elites from 1917 onward frame both the Bolsheviks and the broader idea of democracy as existential threats, and media campaigns were refined in this period to shape mass opinion. So it is that sort of sense of, the ideological Cold War. And this was kind of a theme in your first, or one of your earlier books, not your first book, Silent Conflict, where you really talk about, I guess, the diplomacy around the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Before we get into the main story about, the events between 1930 to 1936, do you want to maybe just set the scene a little bit with this, the way in which, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the formation of the Soviet Union, and the sort of crystallizing ideological conflict, I guess, between the capitalist and the communist world, reflects ideological conflicts both between and within states as well. I mean, there were a lot of socialists even within America, and how that sort of constrained diplomacy in this period.
Let's. I suggest we start with how this ideological conflict affected Soviet foreign policy in the 1920s, because it may come as a surprise to your listeners. We talked about last week. We talked about Maxim Maximovich Litvinov. In the 1920s, he was the deputy commissar for foreign affairs. He was the ultimate realist in applying Soviet foreign policy, but he didn't control Soviet foreign policy, and neither did his boss, who was Georgy Vasilyevich Chicherin, who the specialists on the 1920s love to talk about Chicherin and Litvinov as two people who were rivals and constantly fighting one another. If Chicherin said A, Litvinov said B, or vice versa. But they had one thing in common, and that was that they were ultimate realists. That is to say, they put aside ideological issues. They acted as though they weren't Bolsheviks. They acted as though they were the executors of the Soviet foreign policy and executors of the looking after of Soviet national interests. But they were opposed inside the Soviet government by what I would call true blue Bolsheviks, who wanted to pursue world revolution. So you had these pure revolutionaries fighting against the realists like Litvinov and Chicherin, with Stalin in the middle, sort of playing politics, because he was, after the death of Vladimir Lenin, Ilyich Lenin in early 1924, there was a fight for control of the Communist Party and the control of the Soviet government. And revolution, the continuation of the pursuit of world revolution was a political issue. And Stalin could never let himself be outflanked on his left during these debates, especially against Lev Trotsky, who was his main rival for power in the 1920s. And so there was this constant conflict inside the Soviet government about control over Soviet foreign policy. And Chicherin often had meetings with the German ambassador in Moscow. And on one occasion, German ambassador was really ticked off about some comments in this nasty comments in the Soviet press about the German bourgeoisie. And he said to Chicherin, he said, "Look, inside the Soviet government, you have a conflict going between Comrade Narkomindielsky, this is the Narkomindiel, the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, and Comrade Kominternovsky, which is the Comintern. One sought rapprochement with the West, That was Narkoman Jeltysky. And the other sought to continue the pursuit of world revolution. That was Kominternovsky. These two comrades were fighting one another. And there was a conflict inside the Soviet government, and accusations flew back and forth. On one side, Comrade Narkoman Jeltysky was accused of being a pure opportunist. And on the other side, people like Litvinov and Chicherin accused Comrade Kominternovsky of sucking stupid ideas out of their thumb. And the German ambassador asked Chicherin, he said, well, what's it going to be? Is it going to be rapprochement with the West, or is it going to be world revolution? He said, you have to make up your mind. And so that's on the one side. I don't think it was entirely known in the West about the passion of this debate inside the Soviet government. And in the West, in France and Britain and so forth and so on, United States, they just saw this wild Bolshevik with his long dagger and his smoking bomb. And they didn't understand what was going on inside, fully understand what was going on inside the Soviet government. And so, to make a long story short, ideology, with the exception of German-Soviet relations in the 1920s, were totally screwed up or prevented decent relations from developing between the Soviet Union and the West.
Absolutely. I think, indeed, I noticed in my quick scan of McMeekin, he refers to the Soviet Union being a state like no other. And it was like an outlaw state. And it was this sort of sense that it was both not behaving properly, let's say, but also, I guess, a threat to the regimes in the West as well. And Poland is also part of this background. I guess Poland is crucial to the ultimate failure of diplomacy, the start of the European side of World War II. As the YouTube commenter noted before, there is, Poland is central to some of the negative perceptions of the Soviet Union's role in the 1930s diplomacy as well. Relations between Poland and the Soviet Union weren't great in the 1920s. Indeed, the then leader of Poland, Marshal Piłsudski, was seen as like a bulwark against a communist takeover of Europe. Can you just tell us a little bit more about why Poland is so important to this story?
Well, we should talk maybe a little bit about the 1920s. Well, first of all, in case your listeners aren't up to date on Polish history, the Polish state disappeared at the end of the 18th century, divided up between Tsarist Russia, Prussia, and Habsburg Empire. Disappeared. Poland disappeared from the map until 1918, at the end of the First World War, when it was reconstituted, especially with support from France. And Pilsudski became Joseph Pilsudski became the head of this new Polish government, and he had previously organized military units to fight on the side of the Austro-Hungarian army during the war against Russia. He was, from his point of view, Russia, as I think I said last time we talked, was enemy number one for him, whether it was Tsarist or Bolshevik. And Pilsudski had this ambition to reestablish Poland as a great power in its frontiers of 1772. And war ensued in 1919 between Polish forces and Ukrainians and Bolsheviks further to the east. The Polish objective was to acquire what had been Polish territory before it disappeared from the map. Basically, a war ensued between the Red Army and Polish armed forces. The Poles launched an offensive against the Red Army in April of 1920. This was all-out war between the Red Army and the Poles. The Poles got as far as Kiev. They occupied Kiev in early May 1920, but they couldn't hold the city. They were forced to abandon it forever. And the Bolsheviks launched a counteroffensive, Red Army, which brought its forces to the suburbs of Warsaw in August.
Wow, that far. Gee.
Right. Yeah. And at that point, the Poles themselves launched a counteroffensive, which threw the Red Army back towards the east. What can I say? A peace ensued. Each side was exhausted by the war, and so a peace ensued. Treaty of Riga in early 1921, but neither side was satisfied with it. The Poles hadn't gotten their frontiers of 1772, and large territories, Belarusian and Ukrainian, were occupied by the Poles, which dissatisfied the Soviet government. So neither side was friends with the other, let's say, but the Soviet side had an interest in better relations with France and Britain. This is during the 1920s. And if you wanted better relations with France, the Soviet side had to obtain better relations with Poland, because France and Poland were allies, and you couldn't have a rapprochement with France without rapprochement with Poland. Yeah. So there were some efforts by the Soviet side to improve relations with the Poles, but they were unsuccessful. So throughout the 1920s, Polish-Soviet relations were like cats and dogs.
So that's really interesting. Maybe we'll come back to Poland first as we sort of look at this whole issue of what was Stalin's gamble and I guess why it failed with the various countries. But it's sort of like Poland is a large central country in Central Eastern Europe, and as you say, it's also the diplomatic hinge between the Soviet Union and the West. But just the title of your book is Stalin's Gamble for this period. We're looking at sort of 1930 to 1936. And in 1930, it's when Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, sort of National Socialist Party, really breaks through in the Reichstag in Germany in 1930. So what was the gamble that Stalin was trying to make, in brief, before we sort of go into the diplomatic complexities? What was the gamble that Stalin was trying to make at this time in 1930?
Well, the gamble was a bet that the Soviet side could improve relations with France and Poland and the United States and Great Britain and Romania, Czechoslovakia. That was the gamble. It was the gamble that the Bolshevik could come to terms with the bourgeois and the bourgeoisie or the bourgeois states against a common foe, Nazi Germany. And the first efforts of the Soviet side were successful. We talked about the United States last week as a good example. We didn't talk very much about France. We could now or later on talk about French policy, which was favorable to, at least for a while, to improve relations with the Soviet Union. It was the same reasoning as we talked about last week. The enemy of my enemy is my ally. And in 1932, a radical socialist politician, his name was Édouard Herriot. He was a centrist French politician. He was not too far left and not too far right. He was a centrist. But he had long ago, as early as the 1920s, recognized the importance of better relations with the Soviet Union. And he went to Moscow in 1922. I don't think I told you this story, but he went to Moscow in the fall of 1922, and he met with various Soviet officials, especially from the Narkomindial, and he talked to them about why he thought France should improve its relations with the Soviet Union. And basically it came to this. He said that in 15 years, Germany was going to attack again France. He said this in 1922. So that if you add 15 years, that puts it in the fall of 1937. So you can see he was only off by little F's in less than 2 years. Well, so Herriot was actually Président du Conseil, or Prime Minister of France, in 1924-25, and he came back to power in 1932. And he engineered a Franco-Soviet non-aggression pact, and with the Soviet Union, and he used an image coming from French history. He said, if the French King François Ier could form an alliance with the Muslim Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent against the common foe, at that point the Habsburg Empire, then it was certainly possible for the French bourgeois to form an alliance with the Soviet Bolshevik against the common foe, which would be Germany. So based on that principle, it's relations between France and the Soviet Union improved with the Soviet Union. And at the end of 1933, which I would say was the high point of Soviet foreign policy towards the West. It was the high point. Litvinov made a speech at the end of December 1933. He was speaking. I think he was speaking to a meeting of the Communist Party Central Committee. He said that he reviewed the successes of Soviet foreign policy in the West, with France, with the United States, and in particular. And he said basically that peace and security in Europe could not depend solely upon the USSR, that it would depend, that is to say, peace and security in Europe would depend on cooperation between the Soviet Union and various Western powers.
Yeah.
He said this publicly, openly, and nobody paid any attention to him.
So this is the sort of offer, the gamble, the bet that and ultimately fails and gets rebuffed. It's fascinating how he invoked a kind of I guess a religious divide to describe overcoming the ideological conflicts as well. Let's come back to France a bit later. I wonder, because I guess we all know how the story ends now, that this gamble fails. But it's a very complex gamble because it's not just Neville Chamberlain, waving a piece of paper. There are many other players who are central to this story who are not perhaps so well known in the Anglophone sort of world. And why don't we start with Poland as well? Because, relations with Poland were troubled. We talked a bit about this. Pilsudski is a controversial figure, very different assessments of him. And ultimately, in fact, there's a non-aggression pact, I believe, between Pilsudski and Germany in 1934, well before the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. What was the Soviet Union's approach to Poland in this period, and what led to its gamble with Poland failing?
Well, it was the same principle as in the 1920s. If you wanted to get along from the Soviet point of view, if you wanted to get along with France, you had to get along with Poland. And in fact, we know from Stalin's correspondence with his closest collaborators that he actually was angry with Litvinov for not pushing hard enough to improve relations with Poland. He favored better relations with Poland, and there was some resistance at first from Litvinov because he was afraid that the Soviet Union would spoil its relations with the only Western power with which it had decent relations, which was Weimar Germany. But he changed his position. Well, he had to because Stalin pushed him to change it. But in 1932, there was a non-aggression pact concluded between Poland and the Soviet Union, and that was to be the first step to a further deepening of good Polish-Soviet relations. And there were efforts during 1933, after the Hitler came to power in January, to consolidate Soviet-Polish relations. I would just want to emphasize that the Soviet Union favored an improvement of relations with Poland. But basically, Poland had a choice to make between better relations with the Soviet Union or better relations with Germany. And the Soviet side became aware of Polish negotiations with the German side, and there were some arguments inside the Soviet government about pushing harder to obtain better relations with Poland, and skepticism in Moscow about those possibilities. And finally, in arguments between the Soviet ambassador in Warsaw and the apparatus of the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, the latter was proved correct because the Polish side opted for as you mentioned, the Polish German non-aggression pact and better relations with Germany. That spoiled this first effort on the Soviet side to obtain better relations with Poland.
And was there, like, Pilsudski is, I mean, his ideological orientation, let's say, is sort of a little bit debated, I guess. He is, I mean, as you were saying, he wanted to restore Poland's 1772 boundaries back in, the glory days of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and he instigated a kind of a coup. It was quite authoritarian had a relatively repressive state. But was he ideologically similar to Nazi Germany, or was there an affinity there, or was it more, I guess, anti-Soviet perspectives that drove Poland's policy there?
The Soviet side considered Pilsudski to be a scoundrel and a Russophobe.
Yeah.
And I think he was. But he was a Polish nationalist. He was a determined Polish nationalist, and he fought hard for Polish interests. Mm-hmm. And he had a choice to make. Mm-hmm. Would he get along better with the Soviet side, the Russians, which he hated, which he had fought against during the First World War, or would he try to get along with the Germans under Hitler? And it was basically, for him, it was Poland found itself between two potentially hostile great powers, and the Polish solution to that was to technically try to get along with both. But in fact, when it came to a choice between the two, to get along better with Nazi Germany. And, Poland wasn't all that an attractive state. It was a partial dictatorship, depending on who you talk to. And it was anti-Semitic, and it respected Prussian Germany. And it in no way respected Russia. It was, full of Bolshevik Jews, a constant menace to the independence of Poland. Given those two choices, Warsaw opted for Berlin and Hitlerite Germany. I want to emphasize again, that was not something that the Soviet side wanted. In fact, it represented a failure of Soviet policy.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I guess obviously because Poland gets invaded in 1939, and the complexity of the moral responsibility for the situation sometimes gets a little bit blurred, doesn't it?
You know, the way that Poland is portrayed now is as a victim, but it wasn't a victim. Well, its people were victims. Its people were victims after the Nazi invasion. But Poland was a spoiler of attempts by the Soviet side to organize this defensive alliance, which we talked about last week. It was a saboteur of those efforts. And in 1938, it was a collaborator with Germany in breaking up Czechoslovakia. It even took a small chunk of Czechoslovak territory. I know this will offend Polish listeners, but the Polish government made a lot of mistakes. And the Polish elite, in my opinion, brought on itself what happened to it in September 1939.
The whole issue of historical memory and national memory, it's always so complex, isn't it? One of the other Eastern European countries that you do focus on in Stalin's gamble that is, commonly neglected is Romania, which I think is a country of about 15 million people, 18 million people at this period of time. It's been in the news over the last year or two, but what was its role in the diplomacy of the 1930s and the failed diplomacy of the 1930s?
I think that the story of Romania in the period 1934 to 1938 is very, very interesting. The foreign minister of Romania from 1934 until August 1936 was Nicolae Titulescu. He was a member of the Romanian governing elite. He'd been a finance minister. He had been a representative of the Romanian government at the League of Nations. Titulescu in 1934 was looking around him and worried about a potential threat to Romania from Nazi Germany. He took the initiative, therefore, I think it was in June of 1934, to take the initiative to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and to improve relations with the Soviet Union. That may come as a surprise to your listeners, but he became a strong advocate of collective security and mutual assistance in cooperation with the Soviet Union. A lot of historians, when they talk about Romania, they compare it to Poland, and they say that Polish and Romanian policies were similar, but they were not. Anyway, Titulescu, in pursuing this fresh policy of improved relations, of a rapprochement with the Soviet Union, established close relations with Litvinov. And, from the archives, you can follow the development of Romanian-Polish relations during the next 2 years, and the efforts of Litvinov and Titulescu to conclude a mutual assistance pact. It's remarkable. It's crazy. It's crazy. When I first started working on the subject, I said, "Holy moly! I didn't know that." Anyway, the problem for Titulescu is that he was a bit of a loner. He tried to carry out this new policy without the support of a strong political party, majoritarian political party behind him. He had, at the time, Romania was a monarchy, and he had to constantly seek the support of the king, King Carol. There was a strong right wing in Poland, in Romania, which opposed Titulescu's policy. The Poles, looking at what Titulescu was doing, were very angry, and they launched a campaign in Romania from the Polish embassy to unseat Titulescu. In fact, there were
regime change operations in Romania.
Yes, exactly. Right. Launched by the Poles with the help of the Germans and the Italians. So I see Titulescu as a kind of a noble figure fighting against the odds to achieve, to conclude a pact with the Soviet Union. There, I can't. The full story is described in my book, so I encourage your listeners to look for a copy of my book, and if you're interested in the details. But the long and the short of it is that in August of 1936, Titulescu was sacked as foreign minister, and his efforts to improve relations with the Soviet Union ultimately failed.
Yeah, and that becomes a really critical year. That's the Spanish Civil War, and that's the sort of that's the start of the second book on the failed alliance as well.
And don't forget the Rhineland crisis. Also.
Yes. Yep. And we'll come to that in a minute.
Okay.
What about Italy? Of course, Italy, there's a fantastic television series at the moment, Mussolini, Man of the 20th Century or something like that, which dramatizes Mussolini's early political career. Italy plays a key role here. It's been a fascist state since 1922, and Italy is wanting to, expand into North Africa, and there's a Abyssinian crisis. How does that affect Soviet-Italian relations and the broader European diplomatic landscape?
Again, it may surprise your listeners to learn that the Soviet side again courted fascist Italy to become a member of a large anti-Nazi, anti-German coalition. Mussolini was a fascist, it's true, but he wasn't all that happy about the territorial ambitions of the Nazi state, in particular the desire of Hitler to annex Austria. And so he was open to, Mussolini was open to better relations with the Soviet side. And in, I think it was September of 1933, Soviet Union and Italy signed a kind of non-aggression friendship pact. And And Litvinov, on his way back from the United States at the end of 1933, stopped off in Rome to meet with Mussolini. And, relations at that point were seemed to be promising. And in spite of the fact that Italy was a fascist state, which underlines the pure realism of Litvinov and Stalin at that point. What the key issue was, I repeat this from last week, the enemy of my enemy is my ally. Or as Ariot put it, an alliance of the Catholic king with the Muslim Turkish Sultan. But everything went wrong between Italy and the Soviet side. In 1935, as it became clear that Italy had ambitions to invade Abyssinia and take it as an Italian colony. The Soviet side, how should I put it, was very discouraged by these ambitions, feared for Soviet-Italian relations if an invasion occurred, tried to encourage the Soviet Italian side to try to achieve its ambitions. Notice I'm saying try to achieve its ambitions without going to war. And there's some very interesting records of correspondence between Litvinov and the Italian ambassador in Moscow, where Litvinov explains what Soviet policy was. And basically he said to the Italians, try to sort this out without creating a fracas and a scandal. And we'll be able to have decent relations. And basically he was prepared to sacrifice Abyssinia, except for a small rump Abyssinian state, to preserve the greater Soviet policy of mutual assistance and collective security. He wanted to keep Italy, fascist or not, on side. Because of the Abyssinian War and Mussolini's ambitions and narcissism, the Soviet policy failed. And of course, Italy had trouble with France and Britain. Those relations were soured, and Mussolini had to look to Germany, Nazi Germany, and to Hitler, and this played into Hitler's hands, who offered, of course, to support the Italian side, and it was basically that was the beginning of the ruin of Soviet-Italian relations.
We'll get to the key player, the French Catholic king treating with the Muslim sultan or sultan in a minute. But and we talked a little bit about this last time. But the gamble, Stalin's gamble, is also with the United States. And when FDR was elected in, I think that was 1932 from memory.
Right.
Franklin Delaware, Roosevelt, there was some hope of like Soviet American cooperation, but ultimately, I guess that fails too. Just briefly, because I'm keen to get to France and also what's going on in the Soviet Union at this time. What happens with the relationship between the Soviet Union and the US, and is it again? Does it come back to that sort of ideological conflict, I guess, that we talked about at the start of the program, or?
Yes, I would say that was true. Basically, to make a long story short, the United States sent an ambassador to Moscow. His name was William C. Bullitt. He had been Woodrow Wilson's man in Moscow in 1919 to try to seek some kind of peace with Soviet Russia. That effort failed. Bullitt was a member of an old family, an old American family in Philadelphia. He had a lot of money. He came across as somebody who was pro-Soviet, progressive person. But when he arrived in Moscow as ambassador, I think it was early spring of 1934, he immediately set about with the support of the State Department in Washington to scuttle the accords that had been agreed to between Litvinov and Roosevelt. That's the short story. The long story, readers can read in my book. But essentially, some of Roosevelt's own people sabotaged this policy.
Yeah.
And I ask you, does that sound familiar these days?
Exactly. It does sound familiar these days. Well, and like I've just finished rereading Christopher Clark's book, Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914. And, one of the key themes of that book is the extent to which all these states are very, very divided. And, ambassadors not doing what their bosses want them to do is not all that uncommon a situation. In fact, anyone who's worked in the bureaucracy would know that it's not all that uncommon a situation. Okay, so this brings us to France, and as you said earlier on, Soviet Union attempted to sort of mend relations with France, and there were attempts to negotiate a Franco-Soviet pact in 1935. Indeed, you write that Paris was the hinge of Soviet efforts to organise an anti-Nazi entente, but the hinge was made of poor metal and incapable of bearing the weight assigned to it. And I'll ask about some of the domestic issues that are causing the weakness of that hinge in a moment. But how does Stalin's gamble fail with France that leads ultimately to the Rhineland crisis in March 1936 that you mentioned a little bit earlier?
Boy, that one's a long, complicated story, but I'll try to keep it short and simple. I mentioned Edouard Herriot. He was the first of three French foreign ministers who favored an improvement of relations with the Soviet Union. Herriot was a centrist. He was succeeded by a socialist, or kind of maverick socialist. His name was Joseph Paul Boncourt, and he was foreign minister for about 13 months, which was a long time by French standards during the interwar years. He was a strong supporter of better relations with the Soviet Union. He lost power in it was January 1934 during a very serious crisis in French domestic policy, and which we can talk about if you want. And he was succeeded by another French politician, this time a conservative, traditional French nationalist who mistrusted, one could even say, hated the Germans. His name was Louis Bautu. Those three men were responsible for carrying forward an improvement in French relations with the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, Bartu was assassinated in October 1934, when the Yugoslav king Alexander I came to France. He landed in Marseille.
Wow. Was the assassination a political assassination, or was it like an aggrieved person sort of thing?
No, he was assassinated by by an agent of the fascist Croatian Ustashi. I don't think the assassin was Croatian, but he was an agent of the Ustashi, which was a fascist organization in Croatia. The fascists were everywhere in Europe. King Alexander was killed on the spot, and Bartu was wounded. I believe it was a wound in his arm, which cut open a main blood vein in his arm. His safety was totally screwed up, and he ended up having to walk to the hospital to get help. And by the time he got to the hospital, the doctor, it was too late to save him, and he died. He died. He bled out and died in hospital. What happened afterwards was that a man by the name of Pierre Laval succeeded Bartu. Laval was not like his three predecessors. He was a kind of a renegade former socialist, strong anti-communist, and basically he set about sabotaging better relations with the Soviet Union, so that when a pact was eventually signed in May of 1935 between France and the Soviet Union, it had been reduced by Laval to a scrap of paper. And the interesting story about how that pact was concluded was that Titulescu, the Romanian foreign minister, played a strong role getting the Soviet side to accept I call it the empty shell of the Franco-Soviet Pact in 1935. He wrote a long letter in French, which one finds in the Soviet archives, urging the Soviet Union to agree to the pact with France, even though it was only half a loaf, so to speak. It was only half a loaf. In fact, it was less than half a loaf. The Soviet embassy in Paris considered the letter so important that it was rushed by a diplomatic courier to Moscow and translated into Russian for Stalin. And that letter played a role in the decision, the reluctant decision by the Soviet side to accept the half or less of a loaf of the Franco-Soviet Pact, which Laval had gutted. Perhaps your listeners won't know this, but Laval has a later history. He's turfed out of power. He's turfed out of power in early 1936, but he comes back after the fall of France and becomes a Vichyite collaborator. And at the end of the war, he's tried for treason and shot and I think it was October of 1945. So some people might say he got his just desserts, even if they came a little late.
Yeah, it's a reminder that, I guess our image of France is, left-wing Parisian intellectuals, but there were quite a number of significant right-wing fascist intellectuals in the 1930s in France as well, some of whom later became left-wing intellectuals. And yeah, quite a few people who suffered the fate of Laval as well. That sort of takes us, I guess, to this theme of divided states, because, there's ideological conflicts between states, but within all, as you say, there's fascism everywhere in Europe. There's political divisions between, liberals, conservatives, socialists, fascists. So it's not just a two-way sort of conflict, I guess. One of the things I learned about your book, learned from your book, was that in France, in February 1934, there was actually a fascist coup attempt. So this is like, this is around, when did Hitler become chancellor? When was that? That was 1930.
January 1933.
33. Yep. So a year after. Yep. A year after Hitler coming to power in Germany, there's a fascist coup d'etat attempt in Paris. Can you tell us about that event and, I guess, broadly, its impact on policy, foreign policy as well, within France?
French historians have, I don't know if they've gotten tired of this debate because I haven't followed it lately, but they've debated for a long time whether there were French fascists and a fascist movement in France, and I suppose the historians of France who were trying to argue that there really wasn't a real fascist movement in France. They were just trying to salvage something from the dishonor of France, French policy in the 30s and leading to the fall of France in 1940. I don't have a dog running in this race, so to speak, but I like to apply the duck rule, and that one is: if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. And it just, replace the word duck with fascist. And if I'd have to say that if they weren't fascists, they were pretty close to fascists in France. And in 1934, there was a great scandal called the Stavisky scandal in France. Stavisky was this long-term French crook, scoundrel, swindler, who finally got caught in a scandal, in a bank scandal in southwestern France, and the scandal eventually forced the resignation of the government, French government, at the end of January, beginning of February 1934. And the scandal caused, some people call it an attempted coup d'etat, some people call it a bloody conflict between far-right militias and the police. Some people call it a riot, but in any case, there was a violent confrontation on the Place de la Concorde, across from the Seine, from the Assemblée Nationale on the other side of the Seine. There were a large number of wounded people, There was shooting. There were some people killed. And the American historian, his first name was William Shire, was a witness to the events. And he and other journalists were standing on the balcony, the north end of the Place. I think it was a hotel balcony, and a woman, a few, not very far from him, fell dead, shot in the forehead. Shire wrote that he thought that if the rioters, if you want to call them that, or Purges, if you want to call them that, if they had got into the Chamber of Deputies that day, they would have killed every member, every deputy of the Chamber of Deputies. And the upshot of that was that the French and socialist parties, fearing the possibility of a fascist takeover of the French government, formed a political alliance, which was called the Front Unique. And in the following year, 1935, the Radical Socialist Party joined with the communists and socialists to form what became known as the Front Populaire, or the Popular Front, which was a center-left coalition. And you remember we talked about this briefly before last weekend. And the Front Populaire was different from the initial idea of a union sacrée, which would have been a broader coalition of the left to the center right of French politics. The only way, in my opinion, that Soviet collective security could work. This Front Populaire, Popular Front, frightened the French right and far right. If the socialists and communists were afraid of the right was afraid of the growth of the left and the possibility of a communist takeover. So this split in France between the right, far right, and the Front Populaire, in my opinion, ruined any possibility of success for Soviet policy in France.
So the sort of domestic political conflicts sort of undermine the conditions that make possible Stalin's gamble. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And what happened was after the Popular Front took power, there were still some efforts to improve relations with the Soviet Union, but those relations were scuttled from various politicians and from the French High Command. And I thought I would just read to you a couple of quotations which kind of underline the positions of the two sides. The first quotation comes from Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was, in 1936, was a colonel in the French army. Very conservative man, strong Catholic background.
Later president of France, of course.
Yeah, later, leader of the French resistance during the Second World War, and eventually president of France. His mother, he maintained a correspondence with his mother, who was still alive at that time, and his mother had asked him about the possibility of a Franco-Soviet military cooperation. And here's what de Gaulle had to say. I've translated from the French. Mm-hmm. You ask me what I think of the Franco-Russian Pact? My answer will be very simple. We are rapidly going to war against Germany, and if things go badly for us, Italy will not fail to take advantage of it and kick us in the ass. It's a question of survival. All the rest is literature. Now I ask you, who can we count on to help us with weapons in hand? Poland is nothing. Besides, she is playing a double game. We talked about that. England has its fleet, but no army and an air force that is currently very backward. We do not have the means to refuse the assistance of the Russians, however much we hate their regime. It's the story of Francois I allied with the Muslims, the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, against Charles V of the Habsburg Empire.
Is Herio's reference again.
Right.
Fantastic.
Exactly.
That is, and I mean, yeah, that's a brilliant quotation.
Okay, here's the kicker.
Yeah.
The French High Command, de Gaulle was an outsider. He wasn't part of the French High Command. And the French High Command was playing the Russians. And here's a quotation 2 months later from a deputy chief of staff. His name was Victor Henri Schweizguth. Nobody's ever heard of him, I'm sure, but he was a deputy chief of staff, and he kept a journal during these years, and he often talks about the shenanigans going on in the general staff to scuttle better Franco-Soviet relations. And here's what he writes. I'm quoting again from the French. He's talking about the French High Command's directive. It was, I quote, not to rush, but to avoid giving the Russians the impression that they are being played, which could push them into a political about face with Germany. In other words, the conclusion of an accord with Germany. The situation is still the same. Game time without putting off the Russians and without moving on to staff talks. End of quote.
A wonderful reminder that deceptive diplomacy is not a new invention, I guess. Isn't there that quote that a diplomat is I think, is it something like, it might even be a gentleman, but is a person sent abroad to lie for their country. But
No, I agree. I disagree. Yeah. A good diplomat does not lie. A good diplomat simply avoids telling the truth.
That's right. I think it was the Spycatcher case where the British head of the Cabinet Office, I think, famously said, he wasn't lying. He was being economical with the truth.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Fantastic. So, did you want to just briefly mention the Rhineland crisis, which is a big event, and then we might turn to the Soviet Union.
The Rhineland crisis. A lot of the conventional literature histories that you read about the Rhineland crisis don't really underestimate its impact on foreign relations in Europe after that time. The Rhineland was a demilitarized zone on the left bank of the Rhine River, which helped to protect Soviet French security. It was set up via the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Anyway, I'm going to go real fast on this. In March of 1936, Hitler sent the German army into the Rhineland to reoccupy it and to militarize it. The effect of this action, which the French and British did nothing to stop, was that it made it much more difficult for the French to help its Polish, Romanian, and Czechoslovakian allies. Because once fortified, it would be much harder for the French army to get into Germany. The impact of this on Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania is, I think, is underestimated by historians, because what the effect of it was to destroy the confidence of France's East European allies in being able to count on French support in the event of war with Nazi Germany. And once that confidence was lost, these three countries, the elites in these three countries began to think that the best solution for them, because France would not live up to its obligations, the best solution for them, and this included in Czechoslovakia, was to come to terms with Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. And you can see how this totally undid the French security and the French prestige and the French position in Europe.
So 1936 is just absolutely crucial. I mean, I guess the traditional accounts focus on the Munich crisis in 38, but 1936, it's sort of like there's political crises within France, which, changed the dynamics of the foreign policy. There's the Rhineland crisis, which breaks apart the sort of France, Eastern European alliance sort of thing, which is also kind of a premise of the anti-Nazi Entente. And then, of course, there's the Spanish Civil War, which then exacerbates all these sorts of issues. And I guess the ideological conflicts as well. So that is extraordinary. And that then leads us into the story in book 2, which, of course, is Stalin's failed alliance. But, yeah, absolutely crucial event. Why don't we turn then now to the Soviet Union itself, Stalin's Soviet Union. And he must be sort of sensing things aren't going entirely to plan by 1936. Stepping back from the foreign policy, of course, 1930s is, one of the most controversial periods, arguably one of the darkest periods in the history of the Soviet Union and all the various states that have subsequently came out of the Soviet Union. There was the, Stalin's revolution from above, the industrialization, the collectivization, the internal purges and political terror. And controversially, the sort of Holodomor Red Famine in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other parts of the Soviet Union. How does this, and we talked earlier about the political conflict between the radical world revolutionaries and the, socialism in one country group within the Soviet Union in the 1920s. I guess by the 1930s, Stalin is very much more consolidating his power, but if he's conducting purges, there's clearly also political conflict within the country as well. How does this internal environment affect his foreign policy at this point, or the Soviet Union's foreign policy at this time? If that's the right way of putting the question. I guess, these events also very much frame the presentation in books like McMeekin, Stalin's War, and Applebaum and Timothy Snyder and co. about the personality and the nature of the Soviet regime as well, in terms of how it conducts itself as well.
Let's talk a little about exactly what happened. Because my opinion is that at first the goings on in Soviet domestic policy did not affect Soviet foreign policy at first.
Yeah.
At first. Okay. But here's what happened. All the Bolshevik leaders were in favor of industrialization and collectivization of agricultural lands and assets. And the difference between Stalin and his rivals was the question of how fast to go. Some of the Bolsheviks wanted to go slower because they were afraid of arousing the opposition of the peasantry. Trotsky himself was in favor of rapid industrialization, but Stalin was in favor of super rapid industrialization, collectivization, and he justified it in terms of protecting the security of the Soviet Union. He gave a speech in 1931. He talked about all the times that in the history of Russia that the Russian state had been beaten by outsiders, and he said that if we didn't rapidly modernize the Soviet state, that we could be beaten again. And this we, above all else, we had to avoid and had to protect ourselves against. The problem with Stalin's policy is that it provoked a peasant rebellion, a widespread peasant rebellion. The late Isaac Deutscher, a Polish historian on the left, who wrote biographies of Stalin and Trotsky, and had begun to write a biography of Lenin when he died. He called this rebellion, the peasant rebellion, a Luddite rebellion, referencing the rebellion of the English workers against the bosses.
1820s, 1830s.
18. That's right. And the way they rebelled was they broke the boss's machinery, and the Russian peasantry did the equivalent thing. They slaughtered their livestock, they burned their grain, they destroyed their plows and other agricultural apparatus, and the level of violence and the level of resistance against collectivization, Stalin had not anticipated, and it had. You talked about the Ukrainian Golodomor, the famine that took place in 1932 and 1933. Well, the Luddite rebellion was one of the causes of that famine in 1932 and 1933, along with adverse meteorological conditions, vermin infestations, inconsistent, incompetent relief efforts by the Soviet government, and so forth and so on. The Ukrainian nationalists claim that it was the famine was manufactured by the Soviet government against the Ukrainian people, against the Ukrainian peasantry. But in point of fact, the famine affected all of the Soviet wheat belt, and the famine was most devastating in Kazakhstan. It wasn't It wasn't Ukraine which had suffered the most from the famine. The point is that it was the famine was a result of bad Soviet policy, of of the rush to collectivize, of provoking an unanticipated peasant rebellion, of the negative consequences of that rebellion, and of the poor disjointed attempts of the Soviet government to relief efforts to do something to offer relief to the Soviet peasantry, which was affected by the famine. There's something else that needs to be said about Soviet Russia during this period. Soviet Union just didn't pop up out of nowhere. Tsarist Russia was not an easy place to live for the vast majority of its citizens who were peasants, and they were subjected to the laws of serfdom, which amounted to treating the Soviet peasantry as the equivalent of American black African slaves. And that society, for that level, for the vast majority of people, was a very violent place to live. That sort of heritage of violence passed over into the early years of the Soviet state, where Soviet Russia, where the Western powers intervened in Russia to overthrow the Bolshevik government and to support an extremely violent civil war in Russia, which went on until 1921, 1922. And, Stalin, in my opinion, was a creature of this violent environment and was affected by it. The signs of his penchant for violence to solve problems becomes apparent even in 1918 during the Civil War. And for him, some people are apologists for Stalin. They try to skip over the purges, make light of them, explain them away. I don't think that's possible. You can argue about the numbers of victims of the Stalinist show trials, which began in 1936. The archival evidence puts the number around 700,000 people who were victims between 1936 and 1939, who were executed. That other historians add to those numbers. It was a large number of people that were murdered. Sometimes Kotkin, who has written a big, impressive biography of Stalin, if I'm quoting him correctly, said that the victims of Stalin were mostly people that would have gone through fire to support Stalin. They were loyal to the Soviet state to the depth of their souls, and Stalin turned on them, and they were often quoted as saying, "Why? Why?" And the answer came back, "For nothing." "За что?" Zashto, ni zashto. And this affected, well, it affected the armed forces. It also affected Soviet, the Soviet diplomatic establishment, which suffered tremendous losses from the purges. You know, if you're reading the archives, you're reading these reports. I don't know if I mentioned this before. Reading these reports from diplomats in various Soviet stations in Europe, and all of a sudden they stop. And they stop because the diplomats are recalled and immediately arrested, or allowed to blow in the wind for a couple of months, and then they're arrested. There's some interesting papers in the archives about some interviews that the Soviet ambassador in Prague had with Czechoslovak officials, and notably with Edouard Beneš, who at the time was the Czechoslovak foreign ministry, eventually became president. And he flat out asked the Soviet ambassador in this conversation, a long conversation, what the hell is going on in Moscow? He said, you know, we know some of these diplomats who've disappeared. We know them because they worked here in Prague, and we liked them and respected them. And how can this be defended?
It is, yeah, it really is an astonishing thing. And I guess people are going to be putting forward various interpretations for this over many years. Like I know I've done quite a bit of reading over the years on Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Grozny, Ivan IV, you know, who in a way, I don't know, you know, there was a famous film of Ivan the Terrible made by Eisenstein in around about this time. But, you know, at one point, you know, Ivan does sort of turn on his internal enemies very much, and no one can entirely explain the violence. And I guess in a way it's a difficult thing to explain. But you know, explaining it is one thing, excusing it is a whole other kind of thing as well, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
But how does this? Because you mentioned the purges, the show trials, begin in 1936. Again, this crucial year where everything seems to just implode. What's the consequence for Stalin's gamble of these purges and the internal sort of violence, I guess?
Well, if you look at it, you know, as a historian looking back, it's for me, it's clear that the Soviet policy had failed by at the point where Titulescu is thrown out of power. But the Soviet side didn't see it that way, of course. You know, hindsight's 2020, right? A.J.P. Taylor said once that we forget sometimes that the past was at one time the future, or words to that effect. And basically he said hindsight's 2020. But if you look at it from the perspective of now, it seems clear to me that the Soviet policy had failed by the autumn of 1936. But Litvinov didn't see it that way, and Stalin continued to support Litvinov. So they continued in vain until August of 1939 to try to make the policy work. But it had no chance.
And you know, I guess that's a feature of foreign policy, isn't it? I mean, it is sort of carried by a few individuals. You know, it's you don't. You know, it's the foreign minister, it's the leader, and you know, key diplomats and things like that. I mean, certainly the state does help, but a particular policy can be pushed ahead, even though everyone else is sort of starting to disagree.
In the foreign ministry file of Litvinov's letters to Stalin in 1938, there are lots of letters where Litvinov sends this list of 15 or 20 items that needed Stalin's attention before they could be carried out, and basically, Stalin's preoccupation with eliminating all his colleagues, most of them, meant he was too busy to pay attention to important foreign policy issues. Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, that's a good indication of what was going on during the Purges. Stalin himself admitted, I think it was the end of 1938, that they'd gone a bit too far. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess so. Jesus Christ.
In this discussion, we've taken the story through to 1936, and that's where your second book, Stalin's Failed Alliance, 1936-1939, begins. And, we've sort of referenced a couple of the key things that happened there. Of course, 1936 to 1939, the central events of Munich 1938, Czechoslovak crisis, and leading into the sort of Soviet-Finnish Winter War, which curiously was raised by the current president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, in his meeting with Donald Trump on the Ukrainian war, a reference that surprised many people. But I wonder, just in closing, whether I might just ask you how the story you tell in Stalin's Gamble is very different from our friend Sean McMeekin, Stalin's War. There is a point in the book where he says that World War II was precisely the war Stalin wanted, even if owing to German operational elan and Western ineptitude, which does seem to be not entirely consistent with the well-documented story that you've put forward. How would you summarize the differences between this, I guess relatively popular, at least in some quarters, version of the story, and, what does it tell us about international diplomacy, great power relations today?
Well, the first thing, I don't know the exact quotation from McMeekin, but there was a recorded conversation between Stalin and some of his colleagues in early September, where he said something like, let the British and the French and the Germans fight it out. And we'll stay out, and we'll stay out of the war, and I forget the exact words he used, and maybe we'll trade with Germany now, and maybe later on we'll trade with we'll improve our relations with France or France and Britain. Stalin was a tremendously cynical individual, but policy speaks louder than cynical remarks made with colleagues. And Soviet policy between 1933 and August of 1939 was basically a anti-Nazi policy aimed at forming an alliance with the Western powers to contain Germany or defeat it in war if containment failed. Now, if you read McMeekin, you ask what the difference was between think between me and McMeekin, what's the difference between night and day? Your show that you did on Timothy Snyder's work, I think, is also pertinent to some degree to McMeekin's work, and I call his work a polemic masquerading as history, aimed against the Soviet Union, which has little to say about the origins of the war, dismisses the Red Army contribution to the destruction of the Wehrmacht as secondary to the far greater role of the United States. He smears historical characters who advocated good relations with the Soviet Union and lauds those who did not. He gets caught out in tendentious treatment of evidence, and he does this in a book published in an atmosphere on the West of intense hatred of Russia and Russophobia. You got to wonder about the editors who read this script from McMeekin and must have sent it out for peer review. And my guess is they didn't care about the quality of the history and were prepared to sacrifice it because they knew that McMeekin's work was going to make a lot of money for them. You asked about differences with me. I'd say that I was an empirical, archives-based historian. I follow the trails of evidence wherever they lead, and I draw the necessary conclusions, whether they're popular or not. And ad hominem attacks, personal attacks on me or my work are not an argument. They're an attempt to hide an inability to mount a reasoned counter argument.
Yeah. Very well said, Michael. Very well said. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we, as it happens, coincidentally, we are recording this interview on, at least in Australian time, on the 3rd of September, a couple of hours before the major commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in the Pacific, so the actual end of the global war of World War II. And, like there's been comments in the Australian press just in the last couple of days, which are, McMeekin-esque in their attempts to sort of smear China's, I guess, China and Russia's account of World War II and to, present it as mere propaganda, and yet being utterly ignorant of the extensive historiography, like, Rhineland and all the rest of it, that it does present this war better. So I really do hope many viewers, if they've borrowed McMeekin from the library like I did, or God forbid actually bought a copy, do go and seek out a copy of your books, Michael, which of course I'll include links to in the video description below. It's been a fantastic discussion today, so rich, so many issues, and we'll be moving on in our next discussion to the controversial years of 1936 to 1939. And I really look forward to that, Michael, and I really look forward also to hearing some of the comments from viewers too on the video. It's been quite interesting. I know you've had a check in on some of them as well. Of course, not all of them are, as well informed as your good self. But so please do send through your questions and comments, and we may even respond to them in one of our subsequent discussions. So thanks again for joining me today, Michael. It's been a great discussion, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Jeff, thanks very much, and so am I.